Latino, Hispanic, Latinx, and Spanish. Who claims which label? Great question. Throughout history, those terms have been used to kick up debates about identity in these communities. However, today, according to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, the general definition of Hispanic refers to all people that originate from Spanish-speaking countries. That means Spain is an obvious yes, but places like Brazil and Haiti, where they speak Portuguese and French or Creole, well, they aren't included. Instead, according to dictionary.com, they can be considered Latino, which classifies people who descend from Latin American countries, but whose language isn't necessarily Spanish. Latino was a term that started showing up on official U.S. documents in the 1990s. According to the Pew Research Center, many Americans felt that the term was only highlighting people who descend from Spain. According to their data, the two terms were used interchangeably and appeared next to each other for the first time on the 2000 census. Now, with the 2020 census here, they have many more options for self-identifying. It's the overlap between Hispanic and Latino communities where most countries fall. Places like Mexico, Puerto Rico, Argentina, and Cuba. So what about Latinx? Well, according to Spanish grammar rules, Latinos can be a group of Latin men or women. And Latino refers to a Latin male, while Latina is the feminine version. But Latinx isn't part of the traditional Spanish grammar. But according to Pew Research Center, it's used as a gender-neutral pan-ethnic label. Okay, so now that we've cleared all of that up, why does Hispanic Heritage Month start on September 15th? According to the U.S. Census Bureau, starting in 1968, Congress authorized the president to issue an annual proclamation creating a National Hispanic Heritage Week. It wasn't until the late 1980s that an entire month was dedicated to the celebration. And during that month, we honor the contributions of Americans whose roots stem from Spain, Mexico, Central America, South America, and the Spanish-speaking nations of the Caribbean. That means Latinos and Hispanic Americans are included. The 15th of September was picked because of its cultural significance. That day marks the anniversary of the independence of 5 Latin American countries: Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua.